Close your eyes and breathe in the phantom scent of crushed feverfew and damp earth as we step behind the stone walls of a 12th century monastery. These sleepy facts will guide you through the rhythmic labor of the Hortus conclusus, where every herb was grown for both healing and heaven. Drift away into a world of medicinal mandrake and ancient botanical secrets tonight. Did you know that medieval gardens were designed as living puzzles of symmetry and symbolism, hidden away from the chaos of the outside world? We are unraveling the quiet evolution of monastic herbology, from the sacred cloister garths to the potent cures of the apothecary. Let the steady pulse of history carry you into a deep, uninterrupted sleep as we explore these forgotten green sanctuaries. Experience a technical journey through horticultural legacy, cataloging the raised beds and medicinal potency of a time long past. We are tracing the hushed symbolism of the enclosed garden, layering slow historical facts with the gentle atmosphere of a medieval evening. Settle into your pillows for a night of quiet learning and steady, rhythmic storytelling without a single interruption. Welcome to Sleeping with Facts. Tonight, we invite you to rest your eyes, soften the weight of your thoughts, and allow the quiet world of the medieval botanical garden to draw gently around you like the cool stone walls of an ancient cloister. We will move slowly through 11 chapters, tracing the hushed evolution of monastic herbology from its earliest spiritual roots to its lasting legacy upon the green spaces of our own time. There is no urgency here, no rushing, only the slow, rhythmic unfolding of history, one soothing fact at a time. The cloister garth, the enclosed garden nestled at the heart of every great medieval monastery, was conceived not merely as a functional space for growing plants, but as a living theological statement rendered in stone and soil. Its square or rectangular form was understood by medieval scholars to represent the four corners of the known world, aligning the earthly garden with the cosmic order described in the scriptures. Each cardinal direction of the garden carried its own symbolic weight, connecting the labor of the monks to a larger divine geography that extended far beyond the monastery walls. The measured proportions of these gardens, typically no more than 40 to 60 feet on each side, created an intimate and contemplative atmosphere that encouraged slow, deliberate movement through the space. At the center of nearly every cloister garth stood a modest water feature, a stone basin, a low fountain, or a simple wellhead that served both practical and meditative purposes throughout the monastic day. The gentle, rhythmic sound of water moving over carved stone provided a natural acoustic anchor for the hours of prayer that structured monastic life, creating a steady, unhurried background that supported quiet contemplation. Monks and novices would pass the central water feature dozens of times each day as they moved between the church, the chapter house, and the refectory, each pass an opportunity to pause briefly in reflection. The soft murmur of that water became, over generations, inseparable from the spiritual texture of monastic existence. The earliest monastic gardens in Western Europe, dating from the 6th and 7th centuries, were spaces designed almost entirely for spiritual reflection rather than for the cultivation of plants with practical applications. Monks walked their simple earthen paths not to tend crops but to recite the Psalms, their fingers moving along the beads of a rosary as their sandaled feet traced the same measured circuit hour after hour. The garden was, in this earliest form, a kind of outdoor oratory, a place where prayer could be conducted beneath open sky while remaining enclosed and protected from the distractions of the world beyond the monastery gate. Over the following 2 centuries, this purely devotional function began gradually to merge with the practical needs of the growing monastic community. The architectural relationship between the cloister walkway and the central garth was carefully considered. with the covered arcade providing shade in summer and shelter in winter while maintaining a continuous visual connection between the monks and the growing garden at all times. The columns and arches of the walkway were often carved with organic motifs, leaves, tendrils, and stylized flowers, that visually extended the garden's botanical presence upward into the stone architecture itself. This interpenetration of nature and architecture was deliberate, reinforcing the theological idea that the natural world was not separate from the sacred but was instead one of its most eloquent expressions. The ratio of solid wall to open arcade was typically calculated to allow maximum light into the garden while protecting the walkway from direct exposure to rain. Medieval monastic planners drew heavily from the ancient Roman tradition of the atrium garden when designing their cloister spaces, adapting the classical model to serve the spiritual requirements of Christian communal life. The Roman peristyle garden, with its colonnade of columns surrounding a central open space, was transformed into the cloister by enclosing the upper stories and integrating the walkway directly into the domestic architecture of the monastery complex. This architectural lineage meant that medieval gardens carried within their proportions an echo of antiquity, connecting the Benedictine communities of the early medieval period to the intellectual and aesthetic traditions of the classical world. Historians studying surviving monastery plans have noted remarkable consistency in the proportional relationships between the cloister arcade and the central garth across widely separated sites. The ground of the cloister garth was frequently divided by narrow stone or brick paths into a pattern of 4 quadrants, each planted with low-growing aromatic herbs that released their fragrance gently when brushed by a passing robe. These plantings were chosen not only for their scent but for their symbolic associations. Rue for grace, hyssop for purification, and rosemary for remembrance were among the most commonly recorded species in surviving monastic accounts. The divisions of the 4-part garden also carried numerical symbolism relating to the 4 rivers of paradise described in the book of Genesis, the 4 Gospels of the New Testament, and the 4 elements of classical natural philosophy. This layered symbolism gave the simple act of walking through the garden a continuous meditative resonance that deepened with each repetition. The enclosure of the cloister garth by high stone walls was understood in medieval religious thought as a direct echo of the enclosed garden described in the Song of Solomon, where the phrase hortus conclusus, meaning the garden enclosed, was interpreted as an allegory of the Virgin Mary's purity and, by extension, of the soul's protection from worldly corruption. This biblical resonance elevated the enclosed garden from a mere architectural feature to a theologically charged space, one whose very walls were understood as expressions of spiritual boundary making. The height of those walls was typically sufficient to prevent any view of the surrounding landscape, creating a complete visual world within the monastery's embrace. Within that world, the gardener and the garden existed together in a kind of sacred privacy. Among the earliest written records describing the design of a monastic garden is the Plan of St. Gall, a detailed architectural drawing produced in approximately 820 CE at the Abbey of Reichenau on Lake Constance in what is now southern Germany. This extraordinary document, the oldest surviving architectural plan from the medieval period, includes a dedicated garden plot labeled Hortus, positioned adjacent to the infirmary and containing 16 rectangular planting beds arranged in 2 rows of 8. The plants prescribed for those beds, including sage, rosemary, mint, rue, and cumin, represent a careful selection balanced between culinary, medicinal, and symbolic value. The St. Gall plan has been studied by historians of medieval botany for nearly 2 centuries as a foundational document in understanding how garden space was conceptualized and organized in the early medieval monastery. The transition from purely contemplative cloister garden to the functional infirmary garden was a gradual process that unfolded across the 9th and 10th centuries as monastic communities took on increasing responsibility for the care of the sick in their surrounding regions. As the demand for medicinal remedies grew, the simple quadrant planting of the cloister garth proved insufficient, and dedicated garden spaces began to develop adjacent to the infirmary buildings that were becoming a standard feature of larger Benedictine monasteries. These infirmary gardens were typically more pragmatic in their organization than the cloister garth, arranged to maximize the growing area for specific medicinal species rather than to express a particular geometric symbolism. The transition marked a significant moment in the history of European botanical knowledge, as practical cultivation began to develop alongside spiritual contemplation. The physical scale of the cloister garth varied considerably across the medieval period and across different monastic traditions, ranging from the intimate spaces of small Cistercian foundations to the expansive gardens of wealthy Benedictine abbeys in England and France. At the great Abbey of Cluny in Burgundy, which at its height in the 11th and 12th centuries was the largest and most influential monastery in Western Christendom, the cloister garth is recorded as having been of considerable size, capable of accommodating the meditative walking of hundreds of monks during the hours of private prayer. Smaller foundations, particularly those of the reforming Cistercian order of the 12th century, deliberately kept their cloister gardens modest in scale as an expression of the austerity and simplicity that characterized their approach to religious life. This variation in scale reflected the remarkable diversity of monastic practice within medieval Western Christianity. The Rule of Saint Benedict, composed by Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century and adopted as the guiding document of monastic life throughout medieval Western Europe, placed the labor of the hands alongside prayer as one of the two essential activities of the religious life. This principle, known by its Latin formulation as ora et labora, meaning pray and work, gave the cultivation of the monastery garden a dignity and spiritual significance that elevated gardening from mere manual toil to a form of active contemplation. The monk who knelt to weed a bed of medicinal herbs was understood to be engaged in an activity as spiritually valuable as the chanting of the divine office in the choir. This theological elevation of garden work was crucial to the preservation of botanical knowledge during the centuries following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The monastery scriptorium, where monks spent hours each day carefully copying manuscripts, became one of the most important conduits through which ancient botanical knowledge was preserved and transmitted across the early medieval centuries. Works such as the De Materia Medica of Dioscorides, a Greek physician of the 1st century CE who described the properties of over 600 plants, were copied and recopied in monasteries from Ireland to the edges of the Byzantine world, each copy preserving plant descriptions and illustrations that might otherwise have been lost entirely. The monks who copied these texts were not always able to grow or even identify the exotic Mediterranean and Near Eastern plants described in their sources, but they preserved the descriptions faithfully alongside detailed illustrations that were themselves copied from earlier versions. This chain of transmission, fragile and imperfect as it was, ensured that ancient botanical knowledge survived into the high medieval period. The Carolingian reform of monastic life under Charlemagne and his successors in the late 8th and 9th centuries brought a new level of systematic organization to the cultivation of monastery gardens across the Frankish kingdom. A capitulary, an administrative decree, issued by Charlemagne known as the Capitula de Villais, dated approximately to 812 CE, contains a remarkable list of 73 plants that were to be cultivated on royal estates, many of which were also standard features of contemporary monastic gardens. Among the species listed were fennel, sage, savory, mint, rue, and lovage, a selection that suggests close communication between the agricultural management of royal estates and the botanical practices of the monastery. This administrative attention to cultivated plants at the highest levels of Carolingian government reflects the strategic importance that medieval authorities attached to reliable sources of medicinal and culinary herbs. The transmission of Arabic botanical and medical knowledge into Western Europe during the 11th and 12th centuries significantly expanded the range of plants available to monastery gardeners and the sophistication of the medical knowledge that informed their use. Translations of Arabic medical texts, many of which were themselves translations of earlier Greek and Persian sources, were produced at centers of learning such as the School of Salerno in southern Italy and the translating workshops of Toledo in Iberia, gradually making available to Western monks a vastly richer botanical pharmacopoeia than they had previously possessed. Plants such as sugarcane, rice, cotton, and various aromatic spices were described in these translations, and while most could not be grown in the cooler climates of Northern Europe, their properties were carefully recorded and referenced by monastic physicians. The influx of Arabic botanical knowledge catalyzed a new era of intellectual engagement with the natural world within European monasteries. The Hildegardian tradition of natural medicine, associated with the remarkable 12th century abbess Hildegard of Bingen, represents one of the most sophisticated expressions of monastic botanical knowledge in the medieval period. Hildegard's major works on natural philosophy and medicine, the Physica and the Causiat Curie, described the properties of hundreds of plants, stones, and animals from a perspective that wove together practical medical observation with theological understanding of the natural world. Her descriptions of herbs such as fennel, which she regarded as beneficial for almost all human ailments, and of the complexities of individual medicinal plants reflect a depth of practical botanical knowledge accumulated through direct observation in her community's garden. Hildegard's intellectual framework understood every plant as possessing a unique viriditas, a greening power or vital force that connected the natural world to the creative energy of the divine. The Monastic Herbarium, a written collection of plant descriptions organized for practical medical reference, was the primary tool through which botanical knowledge was organized, stored, and transmitted within medieval religious communities. Unlike the lavishly illustrated manuscripts produced for royal patrons or cathedral libraries, working monastic herbariums were typically modest practical documents, their pages annotated with additional observations added by generations of infirmarians and herbalists. These working copies, worn with constant use, represent some of the most direct evidence available to modern historians of the actual day-to-day medical practice of medieval monastic communities. Surviving examples from English and German monasteries contain marginal notes in multiple hands spanning centuries, each edition layering new observation onto older foundations. The organization of the early medieval physic garden, a dedicated space for the cultivation of medicinal plants, reflects a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between growing conditions and the medicinal potency of individual species. Monastic gardeners learned through generations of accumulated observation that certain plants required full sun while others thrived in the sheltered shade of the cloister wall, that some preferred the well-drained soil of raised beds while others grew best in the damp margin near the central fountain. This empirical knowledge, accumulated slowly over decades of attentive cultivation, was rarely written down in systematic form but was passed from one infirmarian to the next through the close mentorship that was a feature of monastic educational practice. The physic garden was thus a living archive, its arrangement encoding accumulated practical knowledge that could not easily be expressed in words. Monastic communities across medieval Europe maintained extensive correspondence networks that facilitated the exchange of seeds, cuttings, and botanical knowledge between distant foundations. A newly established monastery in the north of England might write to a sister house in the Loire Valley requesting seeds of a Mediterranean herb whose properties had been described in a recently received manuscript, and the resulting exchange could introduce a previously unknown species to an entirely new growing region. These exchanges were not merely practical transactions but were understood within the theological framework of monastic brotherhood as acts of charity, each seed packet representing one community's care for the medical needs of another. Over centuries, this network of botanical exchange gradually extended the range of cultivated plants far beyond the limits of their natural distribution. The Benedictine monasteries of England, particularly those established or reformed in the 10th century under the influence of the monastic reformer St. Dunstan, developed notable traditions of garden cultivation that were reflected in the survival of several important botanical texts. The Winchester School of Manuscript Illumination produced some of the finest illustrated botanical manuscripts of the Anglo-Saxon period, including a remarkable version of the Herbal of Pseudo-Apuleius that features careful watercolor illustrations of plants rendered with a sensitivity to natural form that suggests close observation of growing specimens. These English monastic herbariums represent not merely copies of classical sources but active engagements with the living botanical world of medieval Britain, reflecting the specific growing conditions, native species, and accumulated practical knowledge of their communities. The survival of these texts in institutions such as the British Library and the Bodleian at Oxford allows modern botanists and historians to trace the trajectory of English monastic herbalism with considerable detail. The dissolution of the monasteries in England during the 16th century, carried out under Henry VIII between 1536 and 1541, represents one of the most significant disruptions in the continuous tradition of European monastic botanical knowledge. As hundreds of English monastic communities were dispersed, their gardens abandoned, and their library collections scattered or destroyed, centuries of accumulated horticultural practice were abruptly severed from their institutional context. Some of the displaced monks took their botanical knowledge with them into secular employment as medical practitioners or household stewards, gradually introducing their expertise into the growing tradition of English private garden making. The long shadow of this disruption is one reason why the history of English monastic botany must be reconstructed from fragmentary sources rather than from the continuous documentary record that survives in regions where the monastic tradition remained unbroken. The raised bed, a rectangular growing space elevated above the general ground level by a frame of wood, woven wicker, or shaped stone, was the fundamental unit of organization in the medieval medicinal garden, as clearly evidenced by both the St. Gall plan and numerous illuminated manuscript illustrations of working monastery gardens. Raising the growing surface by as little as 8 to 12 inches above the surrounding path level provided several practical advantages that medieval gardeners understood through observation even without access to the analytical framework of modern soil science. Raised beds drained more freely than flat ground, reducing the waterlogging that could kill delicate Mediterranean herbs during the wet northern European winters. They also warmed more quickly in spring, extending the effective growing season for heat-loving species that had been introduced from southern climates. Feverfew, known in medieval Latin sources as febrifuga, a name derived from its reputation for driving away fevers, was among the most consistently cultivated plants in the medieval monastic medicinal garden, appearing in planting lists from foundations across England, France, Germany, and the Iberian Peninsula. Its small white daisy-like flowers and strongly aromatic leaves made it immediately identifiable in the garden, and its modest cultivation requirements, tolerating partial shade and moderately poor soil, made it an accommodating resident of the monastery bed. Medieval herbalists recommended feverfew as a remedy not only for fevers but for headaches, arthritis, and a range of conditions characterized by inflammation and pain, reflecting an empirical recognition of its analgesic properties that has been partially confirmed by modern pharmacological research. The plant was typically harvested in the morning when the concentration of its active compounds was believed to be at its peak. The cultivation of lavender in medieval monastery gardens represented both a practical medicinal resource and one of the most powerful tools for creating the sensory atmosphere that medieval authorities associated with health and spiritual well-being. Lavender's intensely aromatic flowers, when dried and placed in cloth sachets, were used to scent the linen of the infirmary, to discourage insects from the stored medicinal herbs in the stillroom, and to provide a soothing fragrance in spaces where the sick were being cared for. Medieval medical theory, following the ancient Greek understanding of disease as an imbalance of the four humors, held that pleasant fragrances could actively counteract the corrupted airs believed to transmit illness, giving lavender a quasi-preventive medical function alongside its more direct therapeutic applications. The orderly rows of lavender in the monastery garden, their flowers shifting from green to purple-gray as the summer advanced, were among the most visually and aromatically distinctive features of the medieval healing garden. The mandrake root, botanically Mandragora officinarum, occupied a uniquely complex position in medieval botanical culture, simultaneously prized as one of the most powerful medicinal substances available to the medieval physician and feared for the supernatural associations that had accumulated around it over centuries of folklore. The plant's large, dark leaves and small purple flowers gave little indication of the remarkable properties attributed to its thick, parsnip-like root, which medieval herbalists employed as a powerful analgesic, sedative, and anesthetic agent in surgical procedures that would otherwise have required the patient to endure extreme pain. The root's human-like forked shape, it was popularly known as an earthman, was understood in medieval natural philosophy as a sign of its special connection to the human body, and elaborate rituals for its safe harvesting were described in virtually every major medieval herbal. Despite, or perhaps because of, its dangerous reputation, mandrake was carefully cultivated in the restricted areas of the most sophisticated monastic medicinal gardens. The careful allocation of specific raised beds to individual plant species in the medieval physic garden reflected a sophisticated understanding of the competitive dynamics of mixed planting that modern gardeners recognize as allelopathy, the inhibition of one plant's growth by chemical substances released by another. Medieval gardeners observed that certain plants grew poorly when placed in proximity to specific neighbors, and while they explained this observation in terms of competing humoral properties rather than chemical ecology, their practical response, separate, dedicated beds for each species, produced gardens that were functionally well organized by any horticultural standard. The width of the standard monastery raised bed, typically between 2 and 4 feet, was calibrated to allow the gardener to reach the center of the bed from either side without stepping on the growing surface, preserving the integrity of the soil. Structure that supported healthy root development. This practical dimension, documented in both the St. Gall plan and later garden treatises, reflects a refined understanding of working garden ergonomics. Valerian, known in medieval Latin texts as Valeriana and sometimes as all-heel or set-wall in vernacular English sources, was cultivated in monastery gardens across northern Europe for its root, which was recognized as one of the most effective natural sedatives available to medieval healers. The plant's tall, airy clusters of small pink or white flowers made it a visually elegant presence in the garden, while its distinctive earthy scent, described by some medieval sources as both pleasant and powerful, permeated the area around its growing bed. Medieval infirmarians prescribed preparations of valerian root, typically administered as a decoction in warm water or wine, to patients suffering from insomnia, anxiety, palpitations, and the nervous ailments that medieval physicians grouped under the general category of melancholy. Modern pharmacological research has identified the compound valerianic acid in valerian root as having genuine sedative effects, lending contemporary scientific weight to centuries of empirical monastic medical observation. The cultivation of betony, Stochys botanica, known in medieval botanical texts as botanica, was so widespread in medieval monastery gardens that the plant became almost synonymous with monastic herbalism in the popular imagination of the period. A medieval Latin proverb, recorded in several manuscript sources, advises that one should sell your coat and buy betony, an expression of the plant's extraordinary reputation as a remedy for an almost unlimited range of conditions. Medieval herbariums typically credited betony with virtues extending from the treatment of headaches and digestive complaints to protection against witchcraft and evil spirits, a conflation of medical and magical functions that was characteristic of the overlapping botanical traditions of the medieval world. The plant's modest purple flowers and soft, serrated leaves were a quiet but constant presence in the physic gardens of English monasteries, particularly where it grew reliably in the cool, moist conditions of the northern climate. The rose, cultivated in the enclosed gardens of medieval monasteries with a care that reflected both its medical utility and its intense symbolic significance, occupied a privileged position among the plants of the medieval garden. Rosa gallica officinalis, the apothecary's rose, with its deep pink petals and rich fragrance, was the variety most consistently associated with monastic medical practice, its petals dried and incorporated into preparations for eye conditions, skin complaints, and digestive disorders. Beyond its medical applications, the rose carried a weight of theological symbolism in the medieval Christian imagination that made its presence in the monastery garden virtually mandatory. The red rose was associated with the blood of martyrdom, the white rose with the purity of the Virgin Mary, and the fragrance of roses in general with the presence of the divine. The rose garden, rosarium, of a major medieval monastery was typically a space of exceptional visual beauty and deep religious meaning. The sage plant, Salvia officinalis, was regarded in medieval botanical tradition with an esteem that is reflected in the Latin etymology of its name, derived from salvia, meaning to be in good health or to be saved. A widely repeated verse from the Salernitan school of medicine, which served as a teaching rhyme in monastic medical education, posed the rhetorical question, why should a man die who grows sage in his garden? This extravagant attribution of health-giving properties to sage reflected genuine accumulated experience of the plant's antibacterial and antioxidant properties, even if the theoretical framework within which those properties were understood differed entirely from modern biochemistry. Medieval gardeners grew sage in conditions of full sun and well-drained soil, taking care to harvest the leaves before the plant flowered in early summer when the concentration of the plant's volatile oils was at its most potent. The preparation of medicinal compounds from freshly harvested garden plants was carried out in the monastery's stillroom or herbarium, a dedicated interior space typically located adjacent to the infirmary, equipped with stone surfaces, hanging racks for drying, ceramic vessels for storage, and a fireplace or brazier for preparing decoctions and syrups. The stillroom was considered the domain of the infirmarian, the monk appointed to oversee the medical care of the community, who might spend several hours each day in the careful work of drying, sorting, grinding, and compounding the raw materials from the garden into usable medicinal preparations. The air of the stillroom would have carried the complex fragrance of dozens of drying herbs simultaneously, the sharp clarity of rosemary mingling with the warm sweetness of fennel and the cool bitterness of rue, creating an olfactory environment unlike anything experienced elsewhere in the monastery. The carefully labeled ceramic jars and clay pots that lined the shelves of the well-equipped stillroom represented the accumulated medical resources of the entire community. The monastic calendar, structured around the liturgical year with its cycle of fasts, feasts, and commemorations, provided medieval garden workers with a refined temporal framework for organizing the seasonal labor of cultivation. The major agricultural transitions of the year, the early spring tilling, the midsummer harvest of flowers and leaves, the autumn collection of roots and seeds, and the winter preparation of preserved medicinal stores, were understood in relation to the religious seasons that shaped every aspect of monastic life. The feast day of a particular saint might mark the traditional date for planting a specific herb, while the period of Lent's extended fasting was associated with the most intensive work of early spring preparation in the kitchen and physic gardens. This integration of agricultural labor into the religious calendar gave garden work a temporal dignity that connected each practical task to a larger sacred rhythm. The observation of the relationship between lunar cycles and the growth patterns of plants formed an important part of medieval horticultural practice, with gardeners noting the correlation between the phase of the moon and the vigor of germination, root development, and leaf production in their cultivated herbs. Medieval agricultural texts, drawing on ancient sources including the Roman agricultural writers Columella and Pliny the Elder, recommended specific lunar phases for planting seeds, transplanting established plants, and harvesting different parts of the plant for medicinal use. The recommendation to harvest roots during the waning moon and to sow seeds during the waxing moon reflects an accumulated tradition of observation that, whatever its ultimate scientific validity, produced a consistent and internally coherent practice that gave structure to the gardener's year. Modern researchers studying biodynamic agriculture have revisited some of these ancient lunar planting traditions with interest, though the scientific evidence remains the subject of ongoing discussion. The management of soil fertility in the medieval monastery garden was accomplished through a combination of composting kitchen and garden waste, the application of well-rotted animal manure from the monastery's own livestock, and the periodic fallow of individual growing beds to allow the natural regeneration of soil structure. Medieval gardeners did not possess the conceptual framework of modern soil chemistry, but their accumulated observational knowledge of plant behavior in soils of varying condition led them to practices that were functionally effective in maintaining the productivity of the physic garden over long periods of continuous cultivation. Written records from several major English monasteries document the routine collection of waste material from the kitchen, the refectory, and the stable for incorporation into the garden beds, reflecting a closed-loop resource management system that maintained soil fertility without external inputs. The composting process itself was understood by medieval writers in terms of a natural transformation from corruption to renewed vitality, a metaphor that carried comfortable resonances in the theological world of the monastery. The propagation of medicinal plants in the medieval garden was accomplished through a variety of techniques that medieval horticulturists understood with considerable sophistication, including the direct sowing of seed, the division of established root crowns, the taking of stem cuttings, and the layering of flexible shoots to produce rooted offsets. Each technique had its appropriate season and its associated body of practical knowledge transmitted through monastic education. Seeds of Mediterranean herbs might require particular warmth for successful germination, while the division of root crowns was understood to be most productive when carried out immediately after the plant had completed its annual flowering and begun to direct its energies downward into root development. The selection of seed from the most vigorous and productive individual plants within each bed, an empirical form of selective cultivation, was noted in several medieval horticultural texts as an important means of maintaining and improving the quality of the garden's planting stock over successive generations. Winter in the medieval monastery garden was not a season of complete rest but of continued quiet labor focused on the maintenance of the growing infrastructure and the preparation for the following spring's cultivation. The months of December and January were used to repair the wicker or timber edging of raised beds damaged by frost and the weight of accumulated snow, to turn and aerate the composting materials that would feed the beds in spring, and to review and replenish the supplies of preserved medicinal compounds in the stillroom. Some cold-hardy species, notably rosemary, sage, and the evergreen varieties of thyme, continued to grow through the mild periods of the northern European winter, providing a thin but welcome supply of fresh aromatic material even in the coldest months. The maintenance of any heated glasshouse structures, rare and expensive features found only in the most affluent monastery foundations, extended the possibilities of winter cultivation further for a small number of favored tender species. The drying and storage of medicinal herbs harvested during the summer and autumn months was a critical seasonal activity in the monastery stillroom, requiring careful attention to timing, temperature, and airflow to preserve both the appearance and the medicinal potency of the plant material. Leaves and flowers harvested for their volatile aromatic compounds, such as lavender, thyme, and rosemary, were best dried quickly in warm, well-ventilated conditions that preserved the essential oils while removing moisture, typically by binding them into small bunches and suspending them from the beams of the stillroom or drying loft. Roots, which were generally denser and more resistant to decay, were typically cleaned, sliced, and spread on woven rush mats or wooden racks to dry slowly over several weeks. The process checked regularly to prevent the development of mold that would render the material useless. The carefully dried and stored herbs of a well-managed monastery stillroom represented a medical resource capable of providing remedies through the months when the garden itself could supply nothing fresh. The spring re-emergence of perennial medicinal plants in the monastery garden was observed with attention and care by the monastic gardeners who had learned to read the early signs of growth as indicators of the health and condition of their garden stock. The first appearance of new growth from the crowns of established plants like fennel, lovage, and mint, sometimes visible as early as late February in the milder parts of Western Europe, signaled the beginning of the most intensive period of garden labor. When last year's dead stems needed to be cleared, the beds turned and dressed with compost, and decisions made about which plants needed to be replaced entirely rather than coaxed through another season of growth. This early spring assessment of the garden's condition was a skilled task that drew on years of accumulated observation of individual plant behavior, and the infirmarian responsible for overseeing this work was typically among the most experienced members of the monastery community. The slow unfurling of new growth in the medieval physic garden each spring was an annual renewal that carried both practical and spiritual significance for the community it served. The harvesting of flowering herbs at the precise moment of optimal potency was a skill that medieval herbalists refined over years of careful observation and accumulated from the recorded experience of generations of predecessors. The flowers of plants such as elderflower, chamomile, and meadowsweet were understood to contain their greatest medicinal virtue when harvested at the moment the flower had fully opened but before the petals had begun to fade, a window of time that might be as brief as a single afternoon in warm weather. The timing of harvest was further complicated by the received wisdom, derived from classical sources and confirmed by monastic experience, that morning harvesting, before the heat of the midday sun had dispersed the plant's volatile aromatic compounds, consistently produced material of superior quality. These practical guidelines for optimal harvesting, recorded in monastic herbariums and passed from infirmarian to infirmarian over generations, represent a body of empirical knowledge accumulated through close, sustained attention to the behavior of living plants. The cultivation of aquatic and semi-aquatic plants at the margins of the monastery's fish ponds and water channels expanded the botanical resources available to the medieval garden beyond those suited to the standard raised beds of the physic garden. Plants such as watercress, brooklime, and water mint grew naturally at the edges of water features and were collected both from managed growing areas within the monastery precinct and, when necessary, from natural watercourses in the surrounding landscape. The monastery fish pond, a standard feature of larger monastic establishments, used to provide a reliable supply of fish for the meatless days mandated by the Benedictine rule, thus served a secondary botanical function as a cultivated water garden. The damp margins of such ponds were also favorable growing conditions for meadowsweet and various species of iris, both of which were employed in medieval medicine for their astringent and anti-inflammatory properties. The seeds saved from each year's harvest in the medieval monastery garden were typically stored in carefully labeled containers made from ceramic, wood, or dried gourds, kept in the cool, dry conditions of the monastery cellar or a dedicated storage space adjacent to the still room. The labeling of seed stores was crucial to the effective management of the garden's botanical resources, and monastic seed labels, where they survive in documentary records, reveal a refined system of identification that distinguished not only between different species but between different varieties of the same plant grown under different conditions. The exchange of seed between different monastic communities, carried out through the network of correspondence that connected foundations of the same religious order across Western Europe, was one of the primary mechanisms through which the range of cultivated botanical species gradually expanded beyond what could be sourced from the immediate surrounding landscape. A packet of seeds exchanged between monasteries separated by hundreds of miles represented the transfer not merely of biological material but of an entire tradition of accumulated horticultural knowledge. The Hortulanus, the Latin title given to the monk appointed as chief gardener of the medieval monastery, occupied a position of considerable practical authority and responsibility within the monastic hierarchy, overseeing not merely the physic garden but often the kitchen garden, the orchard, and any vineyard that formed part of the monastery's agricultural holdings. The role required a combination of physical stamina, botanical knowledge, administrative ability, and the patience to work through the long, slow rhythms of the agricultural year without the possibility of hurrying the fundamental biological processes that govern the garden's output. In larger monasteries, the Hortulanus might supervise a team of several junior monks and lay brothers engaged in the heavy labor of turning soil, maintaining drainage channels, and carrying materials, while he himself concentrated on the more skilled tasks of planting, propagation, and the assessment of plant health. Medieval monastic records from foundations such as Canterbury Cathedral Priory in England and Cluny in Burgundy contain references to the Hortulanus as a figure regularly consulted on matters relating to the medical supply of the infirmary. The wooden spade used by the medieval garden worker, its blade typically fashioned from a single piece of hardwood, occasionally shod with a thin strip of iron to strengthen the cutting edge, was the most fundamental tool of monastery horticulture, its weight and balance shaped through generations of craft tradition to suit the specific physical demands of turning the heavy, clay-rich soils common in many northern European monastic sites. The rhythmic motion of digging, the slow, repeated thrust and lift that loosened compacted soil and incorporated organic material into the growing bed, was a physical labor that medieval writers on monastic life occasionally invoked as an example of the virtue of perseverance, the body's patient repetition mirroring the soul's steady progress through the long labor of spiritual formation. The sound of wooden spades working in the monastery garden, a muffled, earthy percussion punctuated by the occasional scrape of a buried stone or the whisper of turned grass, was among the characteristic acoustic textures of the medieval monastic morning. The task of hand-weeding the medieval physic garden, removing the uninvited plants that competed with the cultivated species for light, water, and nutrients, was among the most time-consuming and repetitive of all garden labors, requiring constant attention through the growing season if the carefully maintained raised beds were to remain productive. Medieval garden workers understood the competitive pressure of weeds in terms of an imbalance of the garden's vital energies, the unwanted plants drawing vitality from the soil that was needed to sustain the cultivated medicinal herbs. The identification of weeds, distinguishing the seedlings of unwanted plants from those of desirable species at the earliest stage of growth, required a degree of botanical discrimination that could only be developed through long practice and close observation, making the apparently humble task of weeding one of the more cognitively demanding activities in the daily work of the garden. Novice monks assigned to the garden under the supervision of the Hortulanus learned this discriminatory botanical knowledge gradually through a kind of practical apprenticeship in the living classroom of the growing beds. The maintenance of the garden's irrigation system, the network of channels, clay pipes, and wooden troughs that directed water from the monastery's spring, well, or diverted stream to the growing beds, was an ongoing engineering responsibility that fell under the oversight of the Hortulanus and demanded both practical knowledge and regular physical maintenance. Medieval garden irrigation systems ranged from the simple practice of carrying water in clay pitchers from a central well to the more sophisticated lead pipe and stone channel systems found in the wealthier monasteries, where the same gravity-fed water supply that served the cloister fountain could be extended through underground pipes to the garden beds. The seasonal management of water supply, ensuring adequate moisture through the dry summer months while preventing waterlogging during the wet seasons, required attentive daily observation of soil conditions and plant behavior. Records from several English monastic foundations document the periodic necessity of relaying lead pipes and clearing blocked channels as part of the regular maintenance burden of the infirmary garden. The construction and maintenance of the supports used to train climbing medicinal plants, the wooden trellises, woven wicker frames, and simple pole structures that allowed plants like hops, bryony, and honeysuckle to grow vertically against the walls and fences of the monastery garden, represented a specialized craft skill within the overall labor of garden maintenance. Hops were cultivated in several medieval monastic foundations for their use in flavoring and preserving beer, the standard beverage of the monastic table during a period when the safety of water supplies was uncertain, while their young shoots were also consumed as a spring vegetable and their dried flowers employed medicinally as a mild sedative. The installation of a new trellis system against the warm south-facing wall of a monastic garden building, with its regular spacing of horizontal rails to support the developing growth of a trained climbing plant, required both carpentry skill and horticultural understanding of the plant's growth habit. The finished trellis, planted with a vigorous climber and allowed to develop through several seasons, became one of the most visually striking features of the enclosed garden space. The evening task of seed collection and preservation, gathering mature seed heads from plants that had completed their flowering cycle during the summer and carefully processing the collected material for storage, was a quiet, meditative activity that extended the garden's productive labor into the cooler hours of the late afternoon and early evening. Seeds were collected by hand into small baskets or cloth bags, brought to the still room where they were spread on dry linen cloths to complete their drying, and then carefully sorted to remove any damaged or underdeveloped seeds before being stored in labeled ceramic containers. The skilled seed sorter learned to assess the quality of seeds by feel and appearance, the subtle differences in weight, color, and surface texture that distinguished a viable seed from one whose germinating potential had been compromised by poor ripening conditions or insect damage. This close, tactile engagement with the basic material of the garden's future growth gave the evening work of seed processing a quiet intimacy with the most fundamental processes of plant life. The physical layout of the working paths between the raised beds of the medieval physic garden was carefully considered in relation to the practical needs of the garden's daily maintenance, with path width calibrated to allow the comfortable passage of a monk carrying tools or harvest baskets while remaining narrow enough to minimize the area of unproductive ground. Surviving archaeological evidence from excavated monastery garden sites suggests that primary paths between bed groups were typically 18 to 24 inches wide, while narrower secondary paths giving access to individual beds might be as little as 12 inches, barely enough for a sideways shuffle with a broad harvest basket. The surface of these paths was typically composed of compacted earth, gravel, or crushed brick, materials that allowed drainage while providing a stable walking surface through the wet seasons. The regular sound of sandaled feet moving along these narrow garden paths, a rhythmic, unhurried footfall marking the passage of the gardening day, was one of the characteristic sounds of the enclosed garden's daily life. The training of novice monks in the practical skills of garden cultivation was understood in medieval monastic pedagogy as a form of moral as well as horticultural education, the slow patience required by garden work serving to develop in the young religious the virtues of perseverance, attentiveness, and humility that were considered essential to the monastic life. A novice monk assigned to work under the supervision of the experienced Hortulanus would begin with the most basic tasks, carrying water, removing weeds, clearing paths, before gradually being trusted with more skilled operations such as taking cuttings, propagating seedlings, and making judgments about harvest timing. The years of gradual progress through increasingly skilled garden work mirrored the wider pattern of the novitiate, in which the young monk moved slowly from the periphery of the community's life toward its center, acquiring knowledge and responsibility through sustained proximity to those who already possessed both. The garden was thus not merely a site of practical training, but a living pedagogical space where fundamental values were inculcated through embodied practice. The use of organic mulching materials to protect the surface of planted beds from the drying effects of summer heat and the damaging freeze-thaw cycles of winter was a practice documented in several medieval horticultural texts and reflected in the archaeological record of excavated garden sites. Straw, rushes, dried fern fronds, and composted leaves were among the materials most commonly employed to create the insulating layer that protected plant roots and soil organisms through the temperature extremes of the northern European year. The application of mulch was a physically demanding task requiring the gathering and transportation of large volumes of organic material from various sources within the monastery precinct. A full afternoon's work for several monks to mulch a well-planted physic garden adequately before the onset of winter. The resulting insulated beds, their organic covering gradually decomposing through the winter months to add a thin layer of natural fertility to the soil surface, represented one of the most effective and ecologically coherent practices of medieval horticulture. The long tradition of observational record-keeping in medieval monastery gardens, the noting of planting dates, germination times, harvest yields, and the effectiveness of specific preparations, represents a form of empirical inquiry that anticipated the systematic data collection of modern scientific horticulture, even though it was conducted within a very different conceptual framework. Some monastic communities maintained working garden records extending over many decades, their accumulated observations allowing the identification of patterns in plant behavior over time. The years of exceptional lavender harvest, the winters severe enough to kill established rosemary bushes, the spring seasons when early warmth allowed an unusually early first cutting of fresh herbs from the physic garden. These records, where they survive in monastic archives, provide modern researchers not only with information about historical horticultural practice but with valuable proxy data for understanding long-term climatic patterns in medieval Europe. The disciplined record-keeping habit of the medieval monastery thus contributed to human knowledge in ways that extended far beyond the original intentions of the monks who maintained those careful, quiet observations. The enclosed garden, hortus conclusus, as a theological concept drew its primary biblical authority from a single verse in the Song of Solomon, the 4th chapter and 12th verse, where the beloved is described as a garden enclosed, a spring shut up, a fountain sealed. Medieval commentators, following a long tradition of allegorical interpretation that read the Song of Solomon as a dialogue between Christ and the Church or between God and the individual soul, understood this enclosed garden as a symbol of the Virgin Mary's perpetual virginity and by extension of the soul's enclosure within the protective love of the divine. This theological reading elevated the physical enclosed garden from a merely practical space to a charged symbol whose every feature, walls, fountain, specific plants, carried layers of devotional meaning. The monks and nuns who cultivated and inhabited these gardens moved within a space that was simultaneously a practical horticultural environment and a living theological text. The symbolism of specific plants within the medieval enclosed garden was elaborated through the genre of theological literature known as the Florilegium, a collection of flowers of learning, typically passages extracted from the writings of the Church Fathers and organized thematically. Within this tradition, individual plants were assigned moral and theological meanings that were systematically developed and transmitted across generations of monastic scholarship. The lily represented purity and the Virgin Mary. The violet represented humility. The columbine was associated with the Holy Spirit through the resemblance of its flower to a dove. The rose, as already noted, carried the dual symbolism of martyrdom and Marian purity. The monk walking through the enclosed garden and observing these plants in bloom was thus moving through an environment of layered symbolic meaning that enriched the experience of even the simplest garden walk with theological resonance. The wall of the enclosed garden carried its own symbolic weight in medieval theological thought, understood as a boundary between the protected inner world of the garden and the fallen, disordered world beyond it. Medieval writers sometimes compared the monastery's enclosure wall to the skin of the body, the necessary boundary that preserved the integrity of the inner life against the corrupting influences of the external world. The construction and maintenance of the garden wall was thus not merely a practical horticultural necessity but an act with symbolic dimensions, the monks who laid its stones participating in the physical expression of their community's separation from the world. In the iconographic tradition of medieval painting, the high walls of the enclosed garden appear repeatedly as a marker of sacred protected space, distinguishing the interior world of prayer and cultivation from the threatening complexity of the landscape visible beyond. The association of the enclosed garden with paradise, the original Garden of Eden described in the early chapters of Genesis, was a persistent theme in medieval theological and literary culture that shaped the physical design and planting of monastery gardens in ways both subtle and explicit. Medieval thinkers understood the fall of humanity as having taken place in a garden, and the promise of redemption as leading to the restoration of a garden state, the heavenly Jerusalem of the Book of Revelation, described as containing the tree of life whose leaves were for the healing of the nations. The enclosed monastery garden thus stood theologically between these two garden states, representing both the memory of lost paradise and the anticipation of the garden restored. The medicinal plants that grew within its walls participated in this symbolism, their healing properties understood as a partial restoration of the wholeness of human health that had existed before the fall. The garden scenes depicted in the margins of medieval illuminated manuscripts, often occupying the decorative borders of devotional books such as Books of Hours, provide some of the richest visual documentation of the actual appearance of enclosed medieval gardens, reflecting the practices and species of the period with a detail and accuracy that written texts rarely achieve. These marginal images depict monks, gardeners, and noble figures engaged in activities including tending flowering plants, gathering herbs, training climbing species onto wooden supports, and harvesting the produce of raised beds, all rendered with an attention to the physical detail of tools, clothing, and plant species that makes them invaluable primary sources for garden historians. The visual programs of these manuscripts typically related the garden images to the text they accompanied, creating complex networks of meaning between word and image that both reflected and reinforced the theological understanding of the garden as a site of spiritual significance. The plants depicted in these marginal images can often be identified to species level by botanists familiar with the medieval garden tradition. The concept of the Mary Garden, a sacred enclosed space planted specifically with flowers and plants associated with the Virgin Mary through the medieval symbolist botanical tradition, represents one of the most distinctive expressions of the integration of theological symbolism and botanical practice in medieval religious culture. Mary gardens were typically small, intimate spaces planted with species whose names or characteristics carried Marian associations. Our Lady's bedstraw, Lady's mantle, marigold, from Mary's gold, and the white Madonna lily were among the most consistently included plants. These gardens served as spaces for personal devotion, their botanical contents providing a continuous visual commentary on the attributes of the Virgin, her purity, her humility, her compassionate healing power, that enriched the meditative experience of the visitor who knew how to read the symbolic language encoded in the planting. The Mary Garden tradition, which flourished particularly in the monasteries and cathedral precincts of England and the Low Countries, has been revived in the 20th and 21st centuries in a number of church gardens that draw directly on the documented medieval tradition. The tradition of depicting the Annunciation, the moment when the angel Gabriel appeared to the Virgin Mary to announce the Incarnation, within a garden setting in medieval art reinforced the association between the enclosed garden and the divine mystery of sacred womanhood that was central to medieval theological culture. In hundreds of surviving medieval paintings, altarpieces, and manuscript illuminations, the encounter between Gabriel and Mary takes place. In an enclosed garden or before a window opening onto a walled garden space, with identifiable plants such as white lilies, roses, and violets forming a botanical commentary on the spiritual significance of the depicted moment. The lily in these images almost invariably represents Mary's purity. The enclosed walls behind her represent her virginal integrity. The garden itself represents the paradise into which the Incarnation will restore humanity. This repeated iconographic association between the Virgin, the garden, and the plants growing within it both reflected and reinforced the theological reading of the enclosed garden as a sacred feminine space. The concept of the garden as a space of contemplative withdrawal from the demands of the active life found its most sophisticated literary expression in medieval monastic writing in the tradition of texts known as spiritual gardens, allegorical works in which the process of prayer and meditation was described using the metaphors of garden cultivation. Works such as the 12th century Hortus Deliciarum of the Abbess Harad of Landsberg, an encyclopedic compilation of theological learning organized around garden imagery, used the activities of sowing, weeding, and harvesting as sustained metaphors for the disciplines of the spiritual life. The weeds to be removed from the garden of the soul were identified with the vices. The herbs to be cultivated were identified with the virtues. The harvest of the garden represented the fruits of the spiritual life. This allegorical framework enriched the daily labor of the monastery garden with an additional layer of meaning, allowing the monk who bent to weed a bed of sage to understand his physical labor simultaneously as a spiritual discipline. The enclosed garden as a setting for literary and philosophical dialogue had deep roots in the classical tradition, from Plato's Academy, which met in the gardens of the Grove of Academos outside Athens, to Cicero's dialogues set in his Tuscan garden estate, a tradition that medieval thinkers were gradually recovering and adapting through the renewed engagement with classical texts that characterized the intellectual culture of the 12th century. The setting of significant conversation within a garden space carried connotations of productive leisure, intellectual freedom, and the withdrawal from mundane preoccupations that made possible the deepest forms of reflective thinking. Several important works of 12th century theology and natural philosophy, including texts from the school of Chartres, use garden settings for their dialogues, consciously drawing on both the classical and the biblical dimensions of the garden as a space of privileged intellectual and spiritual exchange. The garden of the medieval monastery thus participated in a long Mediterranean tradition of understanding cultivated natural spaces as environments specially conducive to the highest forms of human thought. The transition from the garden as primarily a symbolic and contemplative space to the garden as a site of systematic empirical inquiry represents one of the most significant intellectual developments in the history of European natural philosophy, and its earliest stages are visible in the botanical writings of the 12th and 13th centuries. Scholars such as Albertus Magnus, the Dominican friar and natural philosopher who composed the remarkable botanical sections of his Encyclopedic de Vegetabilibus in the mid-13th century, combined the allegorical and symbolic understanding of plants inherited from the monastic tradition with a new commitment to direct observation of plant behavior in controlled growing conditions. Albertus described conducting specific observational experiments in his garden, noting how plants responded to changes in light, temperature, and water supply with a precision that anticipates the methodology of early modern botany. This emerging empirical sensibility, developed within the framework of theological natural philosophy, planted the intellectual seeds of the scientific revolution in horticulture that would unfold over the following 3 centuries. The medieval infirmarian, the monk responsible for the health of his community, operated within a medical framework derived primarily from the ancient Greek theory of the 4 humours, which understood health as a state of balance between 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each of these humours was associated with specific qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry, and with specific seasons, organs, and temperaments, creating a comprehensive explanatory system that guided the selection and preparation of medicinal treatments for every category of illness. Plants cultivated in the monastery garden were understood to possess these same humoral qualities to varying degrees, and the infirmarian's skill lay in selecting and combining plant materials in ways that would correct the specific imbalance underlying a patient's condition. This humoral framework, however different from modern biochemical understanding, provided a systematic and internally consistent basis for medical practice that gave the monastic infirmarian a degree of theoretical confidence in the treatments he administered. The monastery infirmary, the building dedicated to the care of sick monks, was typically positioned to the south or east of the main cloister complex, a location chosen both for its access to sunlight and for its proximity to the physic garden whose medicinal plants would supply the primary materials of medical treatment. The infirmary was usually organized as a large hall with beds arranged along the walls, with windows positioned to allow maximum natural light while protecting patients from drafts, a combination of architectural features that reflected medieval medical understanding of light and ventilation as important factors in recovery from illness. Adjacent to the main infirmary hall, the well-equipped monastery would maintain a separate chamber where the infirmarian could prepare remedies, consult medical texts, and examine patients in privacy. The infirmary garden, visible through the windows of this treatment room, provided both the immediate supply of fresh medicinal plants and a visual connection to the natural world that medieval medical thinkers regarded as itself beneficial to the recovering patient. The preparation of a medicinal decoction, a preparation made by boiling plant material in water to extract its soluble compounds, was among the most fundamental and frequently performed procedures in the monastery infirmary, demanding careful attention to the selection and preparation of plant material, the ratio of herb to water, the duration and temperature of the heating process, and the storage and administration of the finished preparation. Medieval sources describe considerable variation in decoction technique for different plants and conditions. Some required gentle simmering for extended periods to extract deeply embedded medicinal compounds from roots or bark, while others called for a brief steep of delicate flowers in water that had been removed from the heat to preserve volatile aromatic compounds that would be destroyed by prolonged boiling. The resulting liquid preparations, ranging in color from the pale golden of chamomile tea to the deep amber brown of a concentrated valerian root decoction, were the primary oral medicines of the medieval monastery, administered to patients in measured doses several times daily. The application of medicinal herbs as topical preparations, poultices, salves, and fomentations applied directly to the skin represented a major component of medieval monastic medical practice, particularly in the treatment of wounds, skin conditions, and the joint pain associated with inflammatory conditions. The preparation of a salve required more complex processing than a simple decoction, involving the extraction of medicinal compounds from plant material into a fatty base such as rendered animal fat or olive oil, the addition of wax to achieve the appropriate consistency, and the incorporation of any additional aromatic or medicinal ingredients required for the specific condition being treated. Surviving recipes for monastic salves from the late medieval period, preserved in infirmary record books and medical miscellanies, describe preparations of considerable complexity, some incorporating a dozen or more ingredients processed through multiple stages. The smooth application of a finished salve to a wound or irritated skin surface, a cool, aromatic layer of herbal preparation spread gently over damaged tissue, was an act of care that expressed the infirmarian's medical skill and the monastery community's commitment to the welfare of its members. The monastery's role as a center of medical care extended well beyond the internal community to encompass the care of pilgrims, travelers, and local residents who sought treatment at the monastic gate. Benedictine monasteries in particular were bound by the rule's injunction to receive all guests as if they were Christ himself, a theological mandate for hospitality that extended naturally to the provision of medical care for those who arrived at the monastery in need of treatment. The guest house of a major medieval monastery might accommodate pilgrims who had traveled hundreds of miles to visit the shrine of a particular saint and who arrived exhausted, malnourished, or suffering from injuries and ailments acquired along the road. The infirmarian and his assistants would assess these external patients, provide food, rest, and medical treatment from the Physic Garden's resources, and in some cases arrange extended accommodation while patients recovered from more serious conditions. This sustained provision of medical care to the lay population represents one of the most socially significant functions of the medieval monastery. The bloodletting practices associated with medieval monastic medicine, the periodic letting of blood as a humoral corrective measure performed on healthy monks as a form of preventive medical maintenance as well as on sick patients as a therapeutic intervention, were closely integrated with the medicinal garden's production in ways that are not immediately obvious. Following a bloodletting procedure, patients were typically prescribed a period of rest and a regulated diet that included specific medicinal preparations from the infirmary garden, chosen to restore the humoral balance disturbed by the procedure and to support recovery of strength and vitality. Plants such as parsley, fennel, and various species of mint were particularly associated in medieval medical texts with the restoration of virtue, the vital force, following bloodletting, and were incorporated into the restorative soups and decoctions prepared for patients during their recovery period. The relationship between these therapeutic interventions and the medicinal garden's output thus extended to the aftercare of procedures as well as to the treatment of active illness. The understanding of the specific medicinal properties of the plant plantago, plantain, in its common vernacular name, illustrates the layered complexity of medieval botanical medical knowledge, in which practical observational knowledge, theoretical humoral interpretation, and magical or sympathetic associations were woven together into a single coherent system of understanding. Plantain's broad, tough leaves were observed to have effective wound-healing properties when applied fresh to cuts and abrasions, a practical knowledge confirmed by modern research identifying the plant's antibacterial and anti-inflammatory compounds. Medieval herbalists additionally classified plantain according to its humoral qualities, attributing to it a cooling and drying nature that made it appropriate for conditions characterized by excessive heat and moisture. The plant's common association with well-trodden paths, it grows readily in compacted soil, led medieval thinkers to regard it as particularly appropriate for the treatment of conditions affecting the feet, reflecting the doctrine of signatures that held that a plant's visible characteristics indicated its medicinal applications. The cultivation and use of theriac, an extraordinarily complex compound preparation with ancient origins in the Greek medical tradition, represents one of the most ambitious applications of medieval monastic medical knowledge and illustrates the scale of pharmaceutical sophistication that the most learned monastic infirmarians could achieve. Classical theriac preparations were described as containing upward of 60 individual ingredients, including many exotic spices and rare plant materials sourced from distant trading networks, and were regarded as the supreme all-purpose antidote and preventive remedy of ancient and medieval medicine. Medieval monastic communities that aspired to maintain a supply of theriac needed access to an extensive range of medicinal plants from their own gardens, supplemented by purchased materials from the growing trade in imported spices and botanical products. The preparation of theriac was itself understood as a skilled craft that could occupy a trained infirmarian for several days of careful measurement, sequential processing, and maturation, the final product representing both a medical resource of high value and a demonstration of the community's pharmaceutical competence. The relationship between the monastery garden and the regular visitors who came to purchase medicinal preparations at the monastic gate created an important economic dimension of garden management that is often overlooked in accounts focused exclusively on the spiritual and medical functions of monastic horticulture. Major monasteries in locations well served by roads and pilgrimage routes developed a regular trade in dried herbs, medicinal preparations, and seed stock that generated both income for the foundation and an obligation to maintain consistent quality in the garden's output. The reputation of a monastery's infirmary products for quality and reliability was a point of institutional pride that could attract significant external patronage, with wealthy donors commissioning specific preparations or contributing to the maintenance of the physic garden in exchange for an ongoing supply of medicinal materials. This economic relationship between the monastery garden and the surrounding community reinforced the practical incentives for maintaining high standards of cultivation and pharmaceutical preparation that complemented the theological and medical motivations already present within the monastic culture. The care provided for the seriously ill and dying within the monastery infirmary, including the provision of medicinal preparations specifically intended to ease pain and reduce distress during the final stages of life, represents one of the most humane dimensions of medieval monastic medical practice and one that drew directly on the garden's pharmacological resources. Medieval medical ethics, shaped by both classical medical tradition and Christian theology, recognized the alleviation of suffering as a legitimate and important medical goal distinct from the goal of cure, and preparations from plants with powerful sedative and analgesic properties were used specifically for this purpose. Opium, derived from the poppy plant grown in some well-equipped medieval monastery gardens, valerian, and preparations from the narcotic plants of the Solanaceae family were among the substances employed in this palliative context. The monk who administered such a preparation to a dying patient was understood to be performing an act of mercy that expressed simultaneously the medical knowledge of the infirmarian, the material provision of the garden, and the community's commitment to accompanying each of its members with care through the final passage of mortal life. Hyssop, Hyssopus officinalis, was among the most theologically charged plants in the medieval monastery garden, its significance rooted in numerous references to the plant in the scriptures, from its use in the purification rituals of the Hebrew Bible to the detail in the Gospel of John that a sponge soaked in wine vinegar was lifted to the lips of Christ on the cross upon a branch of hyssop. This scriptural prominence made hyssop almost obligatory in the enclosed gardens of medieval monasteries, where its presence carried a devotional resonance quite independent of its considerable medicinal utility. As a medicinal plant, hyssop was employed in the treatment of respiratory conditions, coughs, bronchitis, and asthma, where its volatile oils were understood to have expectorant and antispasmodic properties that modern pharmacological research has partially confirmed. The plant's small, intensely blue-violet flowers, appearing in mid to late summer, and its compact, semi-evergreen habit made it one of the most visually attractive elements of the medieval herb garden at the height of the growing season. The cultivation of the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, in medieval monastery gardens represents one of the most striking examples of the pragmatic medical realism that coexisted with the theological symbolism of monastic horticulture. The poppy's narcotic properties, derived from the alkaloids contained in the latex of its unripe seed pods, were well known to medieval physicians from classical medical sources, and the plant was cultivated with care in the restricted areas of the most medically sophisticated monastery gardens for use as a powerful analgesic and sedative. Medieval medical texts carefully distinguished between the controlled use of opium preparations in the relief of serious pain and the dangers of their excessive or unsupervised use, showing an awareness of their addictive potential that is striking from a historical perspective. The large, silky flowers of the opium poppy, ranging from white through pink to deep purple, and its ornamental blue-green seed pods made it one of the most visually distinctive plants in the medieval physic garden. Elecampane, Inula helenium, was one of the most widely cultivated and highly regarded medicinal plants of the medieval monastery garden, its large, woolly leaves and tall, yellow-rayed flower heads making it one of the most physically impressive plants in the herb garden, sometimes reaching heights of 5 or 6 feet in good growing conditions. The plant's thick, aromatic root, which smells strongly of violets and camphor when freshly cut, was the primary medicinal part, valued for its effectiveness in treating respiratory conditions, digestive complaints, and skin diseases. Medieval herbalists associated elecampane particularly with the treatment of pulmonary diseases, noting that preparations of its root help to loosen and expel the phlegm accumulated in conditions of lung infection, an application that modern research has partially validated through the identification of the compound inulin and various antibacterial sesquiterpene lactones in the root. The plant was also associated in medieval folklore with the power to lift sadness and restore vitality, attributes that gave its cultivation a broadly restorative significance beyond its specific medical applications. The cultivation of saffron, Crocus sativus, in medieval monastery gardens represents one of the most labor-intensive and commercially valuable botanical activities in medieval European horticulture, reflecting the extraordinary value placed on saffron both as a medicinal substance and as a culinary luxury in the medieval period. The plant's tiny stigmas, the part of the flower from which saffron is derived, must be harvested by hand, one flower at a time, during the brief autumn flowering period, requiring an intensive concentration of skilled labor in a narrow time window to harvest any significant quantity of the precious spice. Medieval medical authorities attributed to saffron an extraordinary range of beneficial properties, including the ability to lift the spirits, strengthen the heart, improve digestion, and enhance the complexion, making preparations containing saffron among the most prestigious and expensive in the monastic medical repertoire. The cultivation of saffron in the sheltered, well-drained beds of an English or French monastery garden, far to the north of the plant's natural Mediterranean homeland, required particular care and skill in the selection of a favorable microclimate within the monastery precinct. The cultivation of woad, Isatis tinctoria, in the broader agricultural holdings of many medieval monasteries reflects the intersection of botanical knowledge with the textile production that was an important economic activity of larger monastic foundations. Woad's leaves contain a blue dye stuff that was the primary source of blue dye for the European textile industry throughout the medieval period, and its cultivation on a significant scale, fields of woad rather than garden beds, represented a major agricultural enterprise for the monasteries that engaged in it. The processing of woad from fresh leaf to usable dye required considerable knowledge of fermentation and chemical transformation, knowledge that overlapped with the broader botanical and chemical understanding cultivated in the monastery's medical tradition. The monks responsible for managing the woad production of an English monastery such as Glastonbury or Ely would have drawn on both botanical cultivation knowledge and chemical processing skills that were not entirely distinct from those employed in the preparation of medicinal compounds. The cultivation of the fig tree, Ficus carica, in the warmest and most sheltered spots of southern European monastery gardens introduced one of the most ancient of all cultivated trees to the botanical landscape of the enclosed garden. The fig's associations with both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. It appears in dozens of scriptural passages, from the Garden of Eden to the parable of the barren fig tree, made it a plant of particular theological significance in the monastery garden. Medicinally, fig preparations were employed for their mild laxative and emollient properties, with dried figs used in preparations for the treatment of respiratory conditions and fresh fig latex applied topically to warts and skin blemishes. In the cooler climates of northern Europe, fig trees were trained against the warm south-facing walls of monastery buildings, where the reflected heat allowed the fruit to ripen in seasons that would otherwise be too brief for successful cultivation, creating one of the most distinctive features of the walled gardens of northern European monasteries. The cultivation of pennyroyal, Mentha pulegum, in the medieval monastery garden illustrates the complex intersection of medical knowledge, traditional botanical lore, and moral considerations that shape decisions about which plants to cultivate in the enclosed space of the physic garden. As a member of the mint family, pennyroyal was a familiar and useful aromatic plant, employed in culinary contexts and in the treatment of digestive complaints, respiratory conditions, and headaches. Medieval medical texts also recorded its use in the regulation of menstruation, a medicinal application that carried complex social implications in the context of the strictly celibate monastic community. The decision to cultivate pennyroyal in the monastery physic garden thus required the infirmarian to balance the plant's genuine medical utility against the complexity of its broader associations, a judgment that illustrates the ethical and social dimensions of botanical decision-making in the medieval monastery. The incorporation of trees into the design of the medieval monastery garden, both as architectural elements providing shade and structure to the enclosed space and as botanical resources with their own medical and symbolic significance, added a temporal dimension to the garden landscape that was distinct from the annual cycle of the herbaceous plants. An apple tree planted in the monastery orchard might live and fruit for a century or more, its accumulated years inscribed in the gnarled complexity of its trunk and the distinctive character of its fruit, connecting the monks of one generation to those of generations past through the shared experience of tending the same individual tree. The elder tree, Sambucus nigra, was particularly valued in monastery gardens for the wide range of medicinal applications associated with its bark, flowers, berries, and leaves, making it among the most multifunctional botanical resources available to the medieval infirmarian. Medieval plant lore associated the elder with a complex set of protective and magical associations that made its presence in the monastery garden a point of negotiation between official religious culture and the older popular traditions of plant magic. The cultivation of garden peas and beans alongside the medicinal herbs of the physic garden reflects the medieval understanding of diet as itself a form of medicine, with the quality and composition of the daily meals prepared from the kitchen garden understood to have a direct bearing on the health and vitality of the monastic community. The Galenic medical tradition that underpinned medieval medical practice devoted considerable attention to what was called dietetics, the regulation of health through the careful management of food, drink, sleep, exercise, and other aspects of daily life, making the kitchen garden an integral component of the community's overall medical provision. Pulse crops such as peas and beans, legumes providing important dietary protein during the meatless days required by the Benedictine rule, were cultivated in organized beds within the monastery's kitchen garden with the same careful attention to soil preparation and seasonal management applied to the medicinal beds of the physic garden. The infirmarian collaborated with the cellarer, the monk responsible for managing the monastery's food stores, to ensure that the dietary needs of sick patients were met through the garden's production. The rare and precious plant aloe, aloe vera and related species, was known to medieval European monastery physicians primarily through classical medical texts rather than from direct experience of the growing plant, which could not survive the winters of northern Europe even in the most sheltered monastic garden. Dried aloe preparations, imported through the Mediterranean trade networks that connected Western Europe to the spice-producing regions of the Near East and Africa, were among the most expensive items in the well-equipped monastery stillroom, stored carefully in sealed ceramic vessels and dispensed sparingly for conditions that classical sources identified as specifically requiring aloe's cooling and purgative properties. The contrast between the familiar intimacy of the plants growing in the monastery's own raised beds and the mysterious remoteness of exotic medicinal substances known only through texts and imported preparations reflects the full range of medieval botanical knowledge, from the immediately local to the globally distributed. The monk who uncapped a sealed vessel of dried aloe in the monastery stillroom was briefly connecting his sheltered, enclosed garden world to the distant landscapes of the ancient medical tradition. The monastic orchard, pomerium or pomerium in medieval Latin, extended the garden's botanical production beyond the walls of the enclosed physic garden into the broader landscape of the monastery precinct, covering substantial areas with the fruit trees that provided one of the most important components of the monastic diet throughout the medieval period. Apples, pears, plums, cherries, and quinces were the fruit trees most consistently documented in the orchards of northern European monasteries, while monasteries in the milder regions of France, Spain, and Italy might additionally cultivate figs, mulberries, and almonds. The management of the orchard, the seasonal labor of pruning, grafting, and harvesting, and the longer-term work of training trees into productive shapes and replacing failing specimens with new plantings, required horticultural skills that were distinct from those of the physic garden but were equally systematically cultivated and transmitted within the monastic community. The orchard in full spring bloom, its rows of trees covered in white and pink blossom, was one of the most visually spectacular features of the medieval monastery's landscape. The vineyard, vinia, was among the most economically significant of all the botanical enterprises associated with the medieval monastery, providing the wine essential for the celebration of the Mass as well as the daily beverage that supplemented or replaced water at the monastic table. Benedictine foundations in the wine-producing regions of Burgundy, the Rhine Valley, and the Moselle were particularly prominent viticulturalists, with monasteries such as Cluny, Vézelay, and the foundations of the Cistercian order developing vineyards of considerable size and sophistication. The Cistercian monks of Citeaux in Burgundy systematically developed the vineyard of Clos de Vougeot, enclosed by a stone wall they built in the medieval period, a site that remains among the most famous wine-producing locations in the world today. The management of a medieval monastery vineyard required a specialized knowledge of vine cultivation, training systems, and harvest timing that was accumulated over generations and represented one of the most demanding applications of botanical knowledge in the entire range of monastic garden practice. The cultivation of willows, primarily Salix alba, the white willow, along the water channels and wetland margins of the monastery precinct provided medieval communities with a versatile botanical resource valued for several quite different applications. The flexible annual shoots of the pollarded willow, the long, straight wands produced by the practice of cutting the tree back to a framework of permanent branches each year, were among the most important raw materials for the wicker and basket-making traditions that provided much of the practical container and storage technology of the medieval monastery. The bark of the white willow, rich in salicin, the compound from which aspirin was chemically derived in the 19th century, was employed in medieval medicine for the treatment of fever and pain. Its bitter, astringent properties recognized in the humoral framework as indicating a cooling and drying quality appropriate for conditions of excessive heat. The regular cycle of pollarding and harvesting willow materials around the monastery's water features was thus simultaneously an agricultural enterprise, a craft resource operation, and a botanical medicinal cultivation. The field garden, Campus Hortulanus, extended the monastery's botanical cultivation into the broader agricultural landscape beyond the inner precinct, where larger-scale production of medicinal plants, dye plants, fiber crops, and culinary herbs could be undertaken without the spatial constraints of the enclosed physic garden. Some medicinal plants, including elecampane, marshmallow, and valerian, were productive enough in the sheltered beds of the physic garden for the community's internal needs, but others, particularly those required in larger quantities for sale or exchange with other communities, were grown on field garden scale in the open land adjacent to the monastery's agricultural holdings. The management of these field gardens required coordination between the Hortulanus responsible for the physic garden and the cellarer managing the monastery's broader agricultural economy, creating an institutional interface between the botanical and agricultural traditions of monastic land management. Evidence from surviving monastic accounts suggests that these field-scale medicinal plant cultivations could be substantial, with some English monastic foundations recording the cultivation of several acres of specific medicinal species. The cultivation of trees specifically for their medicinal bark, most notably the elder, the alder buckthorn, and the cherry, reflected a sophisticated understanding of the distinction between different parts of the same plant as sources of medicinal material with different properties and applications. Elder bark, harvested from young stems in spring when its active compounds were most concentrated, was employed as a powerful emetic and purging agent. Elderflowers, dried carefully in the still room, yielded a gentle diaphoretic preparation used to promote perspiration in fevers, and elderberries, processed into syrup or wine, provided an immunostimulant preparation used to prevent and treat winter respiratory infections. This recognition that different parts of the same plant, harvested at different times and processed in different ways, yielded distinctly different medicinal materials required a level of botanical sophistication that went well beyond simple identification of useful species. The elder tree in the monastery garden was thus a multidimensional pharmaceutical resource managed through the year with careful attention to the seasonal availability of its various medicinal parts. The herb-gathering expeditions that took experienced infirmarians beyond the monastery walls into the surrounding countryside to collect wild medicinal plants supplemented the garden's cultivated botanical resources with species that could not readily be grown in the enclosed physic garden. Plants associated with specific habitats, watercress from running streams, wood betony from shaded woodland edges, pellitory from the mortar of old walls, were better collected from their natural growing locations than cultivated in garden conditions that could not replicate the specific environmental requirements of their habitat. These gathering expeditions, typically undertaken by the infirmarian accompanied by a younger monk learning the identification and collection of wild medicinal plants, extended the territory of monastic botanical knowledge well beyond the garden walls into the wider botanical landscape of the monastery's surrounding region. The accumulated knowledge of wild plant distribution in the local landscape, which stream margins yielded the best watercress, which woodland clearings supported the largest colony of wood betony, was as much a part of the skilled infirmarian's expertise as his knowledge of the cultivated garden. The monastery's kitchen garden, Hortus culinarius, maintained alongside the physic garden, produced the culinary herbs, vegetables, and salad plants that formed the foundation of the monastic diet, with many plants appearing in both the kitchen and the infirmary in roles that reflected the medieval understanding of food and medicine as aspects of a single continuum of natural substances. Parsley, sage, savory, and mint were cultivated as culinary herbs with recognized additional medicinal applications. Leeks and onions were dietary staples that were also employed medicinally for their recognized antibacterial properties. Beets were prepared both as food and as an ingredient in topical preparations for skin conditions. The management of the kitchen garden required close coordination between the Hortulanus overseeing botanical cultivation and the cook, or kitchener, responsible for the monastery's daily meals, a collaborative relationship that ensured the kitchen garden's production was matched to the community's dietary requirements across the shifting demands of the liturgical year. The physical proximity of kitchen and physic gardens in the monastery plan reflected their functional complementarity. The practice of grafting, joining the growing tissues of two different plants to produce a single composite organism combining the root vigor of one variety with the fruiting qualities of another, was among the most sophisticated horticultural techniques practiced in medieval monastery gardens, reflecting a depth of practical botanical knowledge that anticipated modern understanding of plant biology. Medieval horticulturists grafted apple and pear varieties onto vigorous rootstocks to produce trees of manageable size that combined reliable productivity with the quality characteristics of valued fruit varieties, extending the range and consistency of the orchard's yield. The grafting of medicinal plants onto vigorous rootstocks to produce specimens that would withstand the more stressful growing conditions of a northern European climate was a less commonly recorded but documented practice, reflecting the creativity with which medieval garden practitioners adapted classical horticultural techniques to new applications. The ability to perform successful grafting, reading the condition of the plant tissue, making precise cuts, binding the union carefully to exclude air, and managing the recovery of the grafted plant through the critical weeks following the operation, was regarded as one of the marks of the truly skilled medieval horticulturist. The relationship between the monastery's garden production and the commercial markets of the surrounding region created complex economic networks that connected the enclosed botanical world of the physic garden to the broader patterns of medieval trade and exchange. Surplus production from the physic and kitchen gardens, dried herbs, medicinal preparations, seed stock, fruit preserves, and other botanical products, found its way to local markets through the channels of monastic commerce, with some larger foundations maintaining formal commercial relationships with merchants and apothecaries in nearby towns. The apothecary shops that were becoming a feature of larger English and French towns from the 13th century onward often depended on monastery gardens for a significant portion of their medicinal plant supply, creating a commercial dependency that gave the monastery's botanical production an economic significance extending well beyond the immediate community. These commercial relationships, documented in surviving monastic accounts and town guild records, reveal a medieval botanical economy of considerable complexity in which monastery gardens occupied a central role as primary producers of high-quality medicinal plant material. The monastic fish pond and its associated wetland environment supported not only the fish production essential to the meat-free diet of the monastery, but also a diverse botanical environment whose medicinal plants enriched the infirmary's pharmaceutical resources in ways complementary to those of the enclosed physic garden. The management of the fish pond, maintaining its water clarity, managing the vegetation at its margins, and overseeing the sustainable harvesting of its fish stock, was a specialized responsibility within the broader economy of the monastery's agricultural holdings, requiring knowledge of aquatic ecology that drew on observation accumulated over generations. The botanical dimension of this management included the deliberate cultivation of certain aquatic and marginal plants in favorable locations around the pond, creating what was in effect an outdoor botanical garden of water-loving species managed alongside the pond's primary function as a fish resource. Medicinal plants harvested from these managed aquatic environments, watercress, brook lime, water avens, and meadowsweet among them, provided the infirmarian with a range of cooling, astringent, and anti-inflammatory preparations that complemented those derived from the more formally organized physic garden. The literary tradition of the locus amenus, the pleasant place, which described an idealized natural setting combining shade, running water, soft grass, and fragrant flowers as the setting for rest, conversation, and creative thought, exercised a pervasive influence on medieval literary culture that extended from the classical sources in which it originated through the garden poetry of the medieval period and into the lyric traditions of courtly love. Classical texts describing beautiful garden settings, Virgil's Eclogues, Ovid's Metamorphoses, the pastoral poetry of Theocritus, were transmitted through monastic libraries and were known to many of the medieval authors who drew on garden imagery in their own compositions. The enclosed monastery garden, with its central fountain, its organized plantings, and its sheltering walls, represented a real-world approximation of the locus amenus that gave the literary tradition a living, experimental dimension for the monk who wrote within its walls. The intersection of the literary pleasure garden with the practical medicinal garden of monastic life created one of the distinctive cultural hybrids of medieval intellectual culture. The garden poetry of the high medieval period, exemplified by works such as the early 13th century allegorical Romance of the Rose, a vast French poem whose first section, composed by Guillaume de Loris, unfolds entirely within an enclosed walled garden of extraordinary beauty, drew on both the lived reality of the medieval garden and its accumulated symbolic traditions to create landscapes of layered metaphorical meaning. The garden of the Romance of the Rose contains idealized versions of the plants and features of the real medieval enclosed garden, roses, fountains, shade trees, grassy banks, but transfigures them through allegory into a landscape of erotic and philosophical meaning. Medieval readers familiar with the real enclosed garden of the monastery or noble estate would have recognized and responded to these transformed garden images with the pleasure of seeing familiar things made strange and significant. The relationship between the real and the literary garden in medieval culture was thus a continuous dialogue in which each enriched the other's meaning. The development of botanical illustration as an art form in medieval manuscript culture reveals a gradual evolution from the highly stylized and symbolic plant depictions of the early medieval period toward the increasingly naturalistic renderings of the later medieval centuries, a trajectory that reflects the broader shift toward empirical observation that characterized the intellectual culture of the 13th and 14th centuries. Early medieval botanical illustrations, typically copied from classical sources such as the Dioscorides manuscripts, often bear only an approximate resemblance to the actual plants they purport to depict, having been copied so many times through intermediary versions that they have diverged significantly from natural forms. Later medieval botanical illustrations, particularly those produced in the 14th and 15th centuries, show a dramatically increased fidelity to natural plant form that reflects close, sustained observation of living specimens in monastery and later university gardens. This transition from symbolic to naturalistic botanical illustration is one of the clearest visual markers of the gradual emergence of empirical natural science from the symbolic and theological culture of the medieval monastery. The lapidary and herbal traditions of medieval natural philosophy, the two great genres of texts devoted to the properties of stones and plants respectively, shared a common conceptual framework that understood the natural world as a system of meaningful correspondences between visible characteristics and hidden virtues. Just as the red color of the ruby was understood to indicate its connection to the hot, fiery element and its consequent utility in conditions of cold and deficiency, so the external characteristics of plants, the shape of their leaves, the color of their flowers, the texture of their bark, were read as indicators of their inner medicinal and symbolic properties. This doctrine of signatures, as it came to be called in early modern botanical writing, was not a naive or uncritical tradition but a systematic hermeneutic approach to the natural world that allowed medieval natural philosophers to extend existing botanical knowledge through reasoned inference from observed characteristics to probable medicinal applications. The garden, as the site where plants could be observed growing in their full complexity over the full cycle of their annual development, was thus also a site of active natural philosophical inquiry within this interpretive tradition. The encyclopedic tradition of medieval natural philosophy, represented by major works such as the Etymology of Isidore of Seville in the 7th century, the De Rerum Natura of Rabanus Maurus in the 9th century, and the vast 13th century encyclopedias of Vincent of Beauvais and Bartholomeus Anglicus, devoted substantial sections to the description of plants and their properties, creating authoritative reference frameworks for botanical knowledge that were used in monastery libraries across Western Europe for centuries. These encyclopedic treatments of botanical knowledge drew together information from classical sources, biblical commentary, and contemporary practical observation, weaving these disparate inputs into coherent reference sections organized either alphabetically or according to a system of natural categories. The chapter on plants in Bartholomeus Anglicus's De Proprietatibus Rerum, composed in the mid-13th century and translated into many vernacular languages over the following 2 centuries, provides one of the most comprehensive surveys of medieval botanical knowledge in a form accessible to a wide audience of readers. These encyclopedic texts, read alongside the practical herbals used in the infirmary stillroom, gave the educated medieval monk access to botanical knowledge at multiple levels of depth and specificity. The tradition of the Hortulanus, the little garden, as a literary genre in medieval Latin poetry was inaugurated by the monk Walafrid Strabo, who in approximately 840 CE composed a poem of this title describing the plants he cultivated in his own garden on the island of Reichenau in Lake Constance. Walafrid's poem, addressed to his former teacher Grimoald, describes 23 plants in turn, combining practical horticultural advice, medical information, classical literary allusions, and personal affection for each individual plant into a unique composite literary form that blends lyrical appreciation of natural beauty with the practical concerns of the working gardener. The poem's opening description of Walafrid clearing away the weeds and nettles that had overrun his garden during a period of absence, hacking at them with a broken piece of iron and hauling them out by the roots, has been celebrated by historians of medieval literature as one of the most vividly realistic pieces of nature writing in the medieval canon. The Hortulanus tradition of writing personal, affectionate accounts of specific garden plants remained influential in monastery literary culture through the following centuries. The development of the University Botanical Garden, the first examples of which appeared in Padua and Pisa in Italy in 1545, represents the institutional successor to the medieval monastery physic garden, transplanting the organized cultivation of medicinal plants from the religious to the academic context while maintaining many of the practical and organizational features developed over centuries of monastic horticultural practice. The founders of these early university gardens explicitly acknowledged the pharmaceutical and medical functions that had motivated the cultivation of plants in monastery gardens for the preceding several centuries, positioning their new institutions as rationalized, secular versions of the monastic physic garden adapted to the needs of medical education in a humanist university context. The raised beds, the organized allocation of species to dedicated plots, and the systematic labeling of plants that characterized the early university botanical garden were all features inherited directly from the monastery tradition, translated into a new institutional context. This institutional continuity between the medieval monastery garden and the early modern university botanical garden is one of the clearest threads connecting the botanical culture of the medieval period to that of the scientific revolution. The tradition of mapping and diagramming garden spaces, of which the St. Gall monastery plan is the earliest surviving example, became increasingly sophisticated through the medieval period, culminating in the detailed garden plans and planting schemes that appear in the horticultural literature of the late medieval and early modern transition. The production of a garden plan required not only the practical skills of surveying and drafting but also the botanical knowledge to designate appropriate species for specific locations, reflecting the growing integration of theoretical and practical botanical knowledge in the culture of the later medieval garden. Some of these plans were entirely schematic, geometric representations of the ideal distribution of beds and plants within an enclosed space, while others reflected specific existing gardens documented with topographical precision. The intellectual tradition of mapping garden space as a way of organizing and transmitting botanical knowledge contributed directly to the development of the systematic botanical inventory and garden catalogue that would become central tools of early modern plant science. The relationship between the monastery garden and the tradition of contemplative prayer known as Lectio Divina, the slow, meditative reading of sacred texts that was one of the central spiritual disciplines of Benedictine monasticism, was reflected in the practice of garden meditation, in which the physical environment of the enclosed garden provided a setting and a stimulus for the kind of sustained, attentive reflection that was the goal of contemplative reading. A monk walking slowly through the garden with a text memorized from the morning's reading might find that the sight of a particular plant, the rue that was associated with grace, the sage whose name recalled salvation, triggered a chain of meditative associations that carried his reflection deeper into the meaning of the sacred words. The garden thus functioned as a form of three-dimensional mnemonic, its arranged plants serving as visual triggers for the theological and contemplative memory of the trained monastic mind. The practice of garden meditation, while rarely described directly in medieval monastic sources, is implied in the spatial and temporal structures of monastic life and in the accumulated symbolic associations of the garden's botanical contents. The visual program of the great medieval tapestries known as the Millefleurs, the Thousand Flowers, which were produced primarily in the Loire Valley workshops of France in the late 15th century, reflects the accumulated visual culture of the enclosed medieval garden in one of its most spectacular artistic expressions. These large woven textiles, whose backgrounds are covered with a dense, lush scattering of identifiable plant species, strawberry plants, violets, daisies, carnations, and dozens of other recognizable flowers and herbs, create a visual texture that evokes the abundance and variety of the fully planted medieval garden at the height of summer. The famous series of 6 tapestries known as The Lady and the Unicorn, now housed in the Musée de Cluny in Paris, represents the summit of this tradition, each tapestry depicting a figure in a garden setting whose botanical detail reflects a sophisticated awareness of the visual and symbolic language of the enclosed medieval garden. These tapestries preserve in their botanical inventories a visual record of the range of plants cultivated and valued in the late medieval garden tradition. As the last candle of our medieval garden quietly dims, we hope you carry with you the soft fragrance of lavender, the cool shadow of stone archways, and the enduring peace of a world that found meaning in every leaf and root. The monks and herbalists of the medieval age tended their gardens with patience, devotion, and a quiet reverence for the natural world that still echoes through every carefully designed garden today. We are grateful you chose to rest here with us tonight, among the raised beds and ancient remedies of history. May your sleep be as deep and restorative as the rich, dark earth of the Hortus conclusus.